Hey, what's going on everyone? Michael with Fresh Flow Aquatics. Today I'm going to be going over how to set up a CO2 injection system for your planted tank. Since there's a few ways of doing it, I should specify that I'm only going to be talking about using pressurized cylinders and diffusers. I also won't be talking about the benefits of CO2, but if you're interested in that, you can check this video out here. All right, let's get started. All right, so here you got all the equipment you're going to need to set up a CO2 injection system for a small tank. So first and foremost, you have your CO2 cylinder. This is a paintball cylinder. You need to make sure that you get it filled, obviously, and you can tell that there is some pressure in there based on the gauge. Next is the regulator. So the regulator is what basically allows you to use the CO2 inside the cylinder. The cylinder is filled with CO2 to a very high pressure, and because it's such a high pressure, you're not able to just plug an air line in there. It would just blow out of there like crazy and kill all your fish. So what this does brings the pressure inside the cylinder down to a working pressure, something that you can use in your aquarium that's not too excessive or harmful for your fish. So built into my regulator is a solenoid, this thing right here, and that's basically a timer. So I can plug that into my outlet here, and whenever it's set to on, CO2 will come out, and whenever the timer is set to off, CO2 will not come out. There is actually a workaround for that. You can buy plug-in solenoid, but they're kind of annoying to use, and it can just result in a string of other issues that you need to work around. So I'd highly recommend that you stick with a built-in solenoid. And then on top of that, there is this bubble counter up here, and what that does is it gives you a gauge for how much CO2 you're using. So you can tell, 1 bubble per second or 2 bubbles per second, and you want to be right around there for the tank, the size tank I'm using, which is a 15-gallon. And then the another thing you'll need is this diffuser here that hooks up to the regulator. It's basically a little air stone, and that's where the CO2 is going to come out of in your aquarium. And then the last thing we're going to use is a drop checker. That's this little thing right here. You fill it with drop checker solution, and it's a way of gauging how much CO2 is in your tank, right? So you don't want too much CO2. That can be harmful for your fish. But you also don't want to get a CO2 system and barely use it at all and not benefit your plants. So this will help you find the happy, perfect middle ground. All right, so first things first, we're going to want to get this regulator on the cylinder. And so if you look right there, your regulator should show that there is no pressure. As soon as we plug it in or screw it in, we should see pressure in there. Let's see how that looks. All right, so as soon as I've done that, you can see that there is pressure reading in the regulator on both gauges. So that's great. Next thing we're going to want to do is fill up that bubble counter. All right, got a little bit of water. Just going to pour that in. Doesn't need to be absolutely all the way full, but somewhere around 3/4 looks good. All right, next thing we're going to do is get the air line hooked up to the bubble counter. Pretty easy. Just put that air line over the little knob there, and then make sure to screw this in. And basically what this does is it creates a seal. When you're working with pressurized gas, it can sometimes build up and cause this airline to pull out. So it's important that you put the airline in first, and then you screw this little knob down. And the next thing we're going to do is make sure that we plug the solenoid into a timer. You should have your CO2 set to come on 1 hour before your lights turn on, and to turn off 1 hour before your lights turn off. That gives your CO2 levels time to rise by the time your lights turn on, so your plants are ready to start photosynthesizing from the get-go. There we go. Boink. As soon as we plug that in, you can see the little red light turned on. That means the solenoid is working. And so here we go. If we turn this gas on, open the valve, there we go, we got CO2. And so let's say we have that pumping right now. As soon as I unplug the solenoid, gas will stop coming out. And it takes a second to reflect, but you can see the red light's off and CO2 has slowed down. It's always good to get it on a timer in case you're not home at the same time every day to turn it off and on. Really helps you get the most out of your CO2 system, and it prevents any harm coming to the fish in case you forget to turn it off. As far as diffuser placement goes inside the aquarium, you want to put it next to the outflow. That way, the CO2 bubbles get pushed all around the aquarium. What you don't want is them to go straight to the surface. Then you're going to need to turn your CO2 on. I'd start very slowly, maybe aim for around 1 bubble per second, and crank it up as needed. The easiest way to count your bubbles is to set your timer for 10 seconds and count how many bubbles come out in that period. Like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Then fill your drop checker with solution, usually about 15 drops. Turn it over and tap that corner to help get the solution into the little bubble head. And then place that in the tank opposite of where your CO2 is coming out, and it should turn from a dark blue to a lime green color. If you've gone yellow, then you know you have too much CO2 in the tank. If it's kind of a dark forest green, then you don't have enough. You really want to see that lime green color. You can see that this tank is not really optimized for CO2 use. Actually, what happens is the bubbles go straight to the surface, and that's really bad for diffusing. So the longer that those CO2 bubbles are underwater, the more CO2 is getting dissolved into the water. So in order to get it to lime green in this tank, I'd probably have to pump a ton of CO2 in there. And the reason that there's no flow is because I've added this special outflow rig to my tank because there's a betta in there. And my betta's name is Ricky, and he does not like much flow. So this tank is really designed for him, and I'm alright if I get a little bit of algae in here or my plants suffer. But for now, things seem to be doing fine. The CO2 system on my large tank is actually far more preferred for me. I have a 20-pound cylinder which I need to fill maybe every 9 months or so. It hooks directly into my canister filter line that's going into my aquarium. And since my canister filter already does a terrific job at making sure flow hits every corner of the tank, I know that CO2 is also going to get distributed around every corner of the tank. One thing to be aware of if you're using an inline diffuser with a canister filter is that if your outflow is near the surface of your aquarium and you have a lot of water agitation at the top, then you're likely going to need to add more CO2 than you would if the outflow was substantially lower. Reason being is because, like I mentioned earlier, when the CO2 bubbles go straight to the surface, there's less time for it to diffuse into the water. And so it's the same deal. When you have your outflow right at the top of the surface, those CO2 bubbles, a lot of them are actually going right into the surface and opening and becoming part of the atmosphere rather than dissolving into the aquarium. And personally, I don't mind spending a little bit more money on injecting more CO2. The CO2 is actually the cheapest part of the whole setup besides the cylinder and injector and this and that. So yeah, I actually like the trade-off. I like to ensure that surface agitation is taking place because that puts oxygen in the water, and that's good for the fish. And that's all I got for CO2 injection. As usual, thanks so much for watching. Hit that subscribe button if you found today's content useful. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments. I'm pretty good about responding. See ya!